Steve Glickman, the advisor. The financial system is not static. Customs, rules, and laws are ever changing, which leads to both more risk and possibly more rewards, especially for America's hardest hit and poorest citizens. Las Vegas has always symbolized hard-driving American capitalism, as well as an often unequal distribution of the spoils. Vegas is also the place where many Americans are persuaded or persuade themselves to part with much of their hard-earned money. But no one is thinking harder about how to extend capitalism benefits than Steve Glickman. This former senior economic advisor in Barack Obama's government has taken his policy expertise to the burgeoning realm of opportunity zones. His Washington think tank, Economic Innovation Group, helped create and influence the Trump government initiative to create tax credits for over 8,000 low-income areas in America. Today, Glickman's aptly named company, Develop, advises potential investors how best to direct cash flow into this promising new world, helping spur innovation and growth. In Fox and the Hen House, we look at how capitalism essentially flew over many Americans and failed to give them a share of the spoils. Can Glickman's model and vision actually help reduce the gap between the rich and the poor? In this interview, we talk about some of his ideas and the challenges that they face in implementation.
I mean, where to start? Because you have a very interesting background, like between Georgetown, between, Obama, between, like being an entrepreneur. It's kind of like, are you one of those jack of all trades, master of none? Are you like more of an accidental entrepreneur? Are you an intrapreneur that is like, how did you end up in this position? Was there a defining clear path, or are you like the guy who ricocheted and pinball to where you are today?
Well, as you probably know, entrepreneurship is a really good business for people who can't hold down jobs. So I fit that really well. And after moving on from job to job, I figured out what I really like is building things. So my career really started in law, and I was a criminal prosecutor, and then I was an investigator for Congress on the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, and found those jobs fascinating. But politics was always in my blood, and so I got in at the very beginning of the Obama administration, focused on economic policy, because administrations are one of those few places where you can remake yourself, because you're building and filling roles in the government. And my first job was to vet the cabinet members as they came through on down, and so you get a lot of dirt on people, and that's always a good time to ask them to hire you. So that's what I did, and I transitioned. I never taken an economics course after high school. Actually, I don't admit that too much. Hopefully, nobody will see this. And spent my time focused really on manufacturing communities, which is where I was born, where my family is from, Chicago and Detroit. I was born in Detroit, and saw that as much as we were making progress on the economy, we were not making progress in a lot of places that seemed to be in this similar place to where they had been 5 years ago. And when I left the administration in 2013, I got connected with Sean Parker, I think one of the world's great entrepreneurs, and a genius. And we had a mind meld around a way to combine what investors did best with what communities really needed, which is growth capital, and to do it through a way we could systematically create a new infrastructure for how investors invested. And that ultimately became Opportunity Zone. So I've really been in the entrepreneurship space, studying it in communities and figuring out a way to activate more of it since 2013 through what I'm doing now.
So the knock against government is that they can't do anything, they're not accountable, there's a lot of waste. The Economic Innovation Group was a $6 trillion initiative, is that right?
Yeah, so Economic Innovation Group was the think tank advocacy group that created Opportunity Zones, which is a $6 trillion program. The debate between the public and private sector and what each of them does is a totally false debate now. I mean, we obviously need the public sector to do certain big things that no individual company will do on its own.
Such as?
Infrastructure is a really easy example, right? This is something that government used to do really well. We build roads and bridges and massive international development programs. Think about the Marshall Plan after World War II. Rebuilding Europe was a project of the government. Going to the moon is a project of the government. Since then, there's commercial applications to a lot of this stuff, but it really starts with government. In fact, a lot of innovation, as you probably know, is anchored in government funding and government research, whether it's radar or it's GPS or the internet, famously created as a sort of a public-private partnership between the government and Stanford and the military and ultimately the private sector. So that debate is a totally false debate. But what's happened in the country, in my view at least, is that the capital And the political will that the government used to have to build these big projects is gone. We just don't have the ability to fund huge infrastructure projects, huge development projects, and we've changed the tax system so that so much more of it now sits with private investors. And we haven't seriously tapped into that in decades. And the timing, the opportunity zone concept is basically a way to time all the growth private investors have seen in the stock market over the 10 years, which what we thought was the biggest problem facing America, which is the lack of investment in communities that could grow those local economies. And it's now we've launched basically the biggest economic experiment in recent U.S. history through opportunity zones. The way I think about it, it's a way to do that Marshall Plan, but to crowdfund it and to do it through the private sector instead of the public sector. And it's a modern day approach to how you do it because government just doesn't have the tools to do something of that scale anymore.
Do you think that anybody could be an entrepreneur? You've heard the Warren Buffett line, "Are leaders made or are they born?" Do you feel that entrepreneurship is made or born? And can everybody be an entrepreneur?
No, not everyone can be an entrepreneur. But far more people and places can have a robust entrepreneurial ecosystem than we allow now as either local leaders or private sector investors or even entrepreneurs themselves. As you know, it takes a certain type of stomach and risk-taking to be an entrepreneur, a certain ambition, impatience, persistence. I think you said it well, you have to be willing and want to absorb a lot of pain. And not everyone is made out to do that. But the idea, and this is, I think, the big problem in America now, that entrepreneurship is somehow inherently limited to like 6 or 10 U.S. cities is a crazy notion, right? And a lot of the reason why there's so much entrepreneurship in those cities is artificial, right? People have to move there because there aren't the capital opportunities, aren't the ability to fundraise in many cities, or because that's where a lot of immigrants go because immigrants are not welcomed in other parts of the country who are a source of like 50% of our venture-backed businesses. So we can, as a country, change it. We can change how sort of our visa system to encourage immigration to places that need entrepreneurship. We can change our tax system to encourage, which is what Opportunity Zones does, where people make their next investment. We can change the way we treat education. Should education be about everybody going to college, knowing that a third of the country only goes to college, or should it be about giving people different layers of skills so they can do whatever they want to do? So what we don't do well enough as a country is the ability to help people actualize what they want to become in life and try to fit everyone in the same box. And that's where I think both parties are failing Americans right now.
Touched on a lot of good points. Just funny when you named ambition, impatience, and persistence. I wrote an article for TechCrunch once about Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebook IPO. And I said, ultimately, to succeed as a startup, you need vision, ambition, persistence, execution, luck, timing, and eventually focus. I never included impatience, but you're so right. You also need to be impatient. And you wake up in the morning and you're mad, you're crazy about things that other people are like, dude, it's Saturday, just sleep. Right? Okay, so ultimately, one of the things that has made these areas associated historically with startups, i.e. Silicon Valley, is that it's gotten so expensive. And startups need to have low burn rate early on, right? So how much of this initiative that you're pursuing is because those traditional places got too expensive, got too corporate even in some ways? Like you start up a startup, you have 20 million in the bank, I'm gonna tell you you're not really gonna be startup-ish. And how much of it is more that, no, it's just nothing to do with Silicon Valley, it's just there needs to be more entrepreneurship in Kansas, and by God, there are entrepreneurs in Kansas.
Well, I guess at the end it's a little bit of both. It really started from two premises. One, we have this now 40-year plus decline in entrepreneurship across the country in general. And that's a problem.
Is that a fact? Really?
It's a fact, for sure. We're creating less new businesses now than we have ever before, and that's a long-term ratio that goes down. It's also a reflection of where capital markets are going. So, 75% of venture capital gets invested in just 3 states. New York, California, Massachusetts, so sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that's where you're going to see scalable companies. 25% split by the rest of the country. That's true across a number of other markers. If you look at where branches of banks are, where small banks are around the country, they've started to shrink up as they've been absorbed into these big banks, so you don't have access to your community bank in your neighborhood anymore. So there's been massive changes in how the economy works over time. And so this is really focused on the 95% plus of places that are not San Francisco, LA, and New York. But the reality is for those places, they're losing, particularly San Francisco, is losing more people on net every year because it's just not a place that has a quality of life that people want. I mean, to have to spend $1 million to buy your first studio apartment is insane, and it makes those places unhappy as well. And so the notion that this is really pushing against is the idea that, well, we should just let the market work itself out. Like, it's fine, we'll let cities fail, which is a totally false construct. Cities don't fail. 10% of the most talented, well-connected people leave, and they enter a downward spiral they can never get out of, but people can't move. To move to San Francisco, it's not like if you grow up in Dayton, Ohio, and you don't go to college and you don't have a lot of money, you can pick up and move to San Francisco. That's just not the way it works.
Impossible.
So you have to create homegrown business growth and job creation that transitions places that were one industry towns in the middle of America and provides more economic options. And we're just terrible at doing that as a society. We're terrible. The government's failing at it. Big business, which used to do this, has stopped doing it because they've become themselves concentrated in a handful of cities. And so who is left to take care of it? Really nobody, and that's why you see these failing cities. And it's not just an economics issue, right? Those failing cities lead to an incredible amount of unhappiness during a time when our economy feels very strong to the outside world. Tons of job creation, pretty good GDP growth, super low unemployment, and yet 50% plus of the country says we're really unhappy. And I think this last election in particular was a warning sign to everyone, not just the politicians, but also, as you see it increasingly, the Ray Dalios of the world and the BlackRocks of the world, the Jeffrey Franks of the world, who say, wait a minute, this is all going to collapse on us. It only makes sense for us to make all this money as long as everyone else buys into that. That's fair enough, and people are no longer buying into it. And that's, of course, and I don't want to be too dramatic, but that's where you lead to revolution and civil war and massive unrest. And we're pretty close to that, I'd argue. And I do think President Trump's election and the Trump administration has been a pretty good steward of the Opportunity Zones program, but I believe his administration is an expression from voters that they're ready to throw it all against the wall. And that's a pretty dangerous place to be for a democracy.
If you're living paycheck to paycheck, to hear like the Ray Dalios, who's a great principled man, and to hear Jamie Dimon, whose heart's probably in the right place, showing up and saying, I've got the solution. You mentioned being dramatic. I'm going to be dramatic. Is that not like Harvey Weinstein coming out and saying, I'm going to write the book on how to fix Me Too? You know what I mean? I'm exaggerating, obviously, but I mean, you're speaking to that audience, let's say, as they're living paycheck to paycheck. Why should these people be the ones you trust?
Well, I'm not suggesting trust them, but I am suggesting we use all the tools we have at our disposal. So if the goal here is to create growth, economic growth in places, that's a result of investment. When you look at what growth is made up of, it's essentially made up of the government making investments, the private sector community making investments, and people making investment. And increasingly, those tools are more and more limited. We can't count on the government to make investments, although they should be making more, particularly in places like infrastructure. We can't count on companies making investments, although perhaps we need a regulatory structure that puts more pressure on them. But we do need some carrots, too, to get folks that have the capital in this economy to put that capital to good use. And this is not a novel concept. We do this all the time through the tax code. I'll give you a couple super simple examples. When we want people to give to charity, you know what we do? We give them a huge tax incentive to do it. We say you can deduct whatever you give to charity. You don't have to pay it in taxes as a way to build our philanthropic market. If we want people to buy houses, you can argue whether that's a good or bad outcome. We give them a huge tax deduction to buy houses. And if we want people to invest in the next Silicon Valley that's not on the coast, then it's going to take that incentive as well. And it only works as an incentive if they're making profitable investments in growing companies. So I think it's fine to see the private sector win and those communities win. And I ask folks who are skeptical of that, what's the alternative? Give me a better way to get capital into those communities than from the capitalists.
So take me through the playbook. What do you actually do when you show up in Wichita, Kansas?
Well,
No knock against Wichita, Kansas, by the way, but what do? You show up?
Well, first of all, when we talk about opportunity zones in general as the incentive, so to use that as an example, we're talking about a subsidy and an incentive for equity investments across a big variety of asset classes. And what the needs are and what the good investments are in different places are going to be very localized. Some places are going to need a ton of commercial real estate. Every place really needs housing. They're going to need their downtowns revitalized. A big part of what we're seeing in the Midwest is a move from the suburbs to downtowns that has come long after you've seen that happen on the coast, where that's been the case for a while, because you need that concentration of people to generate the ecosystem that ultimately can lead to entrepreneurship, right? Entrepreneurship is very much about collision and concentration and having people together.
Collision or collusion?
Well, in this case, I said collision.
Okay.
Entrepreneurship is about collision. You could argue there's no collusion. I'm not the first person to say that. So you need that concentration. I believe there are entrepreneurs in lots of cities around the world. As I've done some traveling with Steve Case through his Rise of the Rest tour, gone to nearly 50 cities now, including places in Nebraska. Omaha and Lincoln was one of the more recent trips in the middle of the country, and you'd be surprised about the really interesting companies you see in places like that. Indianapolis has had a huge unicorn, a $2 billion company that got bought by Salesforce called ExactTarget, which created a ton of local venture capital and growth. Birmingham, Alabama, same thing. Don't think about Birmingham, Alabama as an entrepreneurship hub. They had a company there called Shipt, which was a competitor to Instacart, that got sold to Target for $550 million and started a huge local form of wealth and capital investment in Birmingham. So different places are going to have different needs and different opportunities. The reality is, it's not that there's not things to invest in those places. It's that investors in mass are pretty lazy. I mean, they're herd animals. They want to invest where they know other people are investing. And so they're going to go to these overcrowded, super performing markets. And I'm not convinced those are the best bets, because for in this Opportunity Zone program, you only really get the incentive for investing for 10 years or more. So you're making a 10-year bet. And I think it's much more likely you're going to see 10 years of growth in Chicago or St. Louis or Birmingham or Atlanta than you're going to see the same amount of growth in San Francisco, which is probably near its peak.
So I don't want to assume that just because you were a senior economic advisor to President Obama that you disagree with President Trump's policies. So just as a setup to where I want to go, what are your thoughts on President Trump's policies? Well,
so I'm not much of a supporter of the Trump administration in general. We've worked very closely when I was the CEO of the Economic Innovation Group, and since then have worked closely with the administration specifically around creating the framework and the rules and the regulations of the Opportunity Zones program. And I think they've done a pretty good job of it. But in general, as someone who's the grandson of immigrants and refugees, so from a personal level, and then also from the perspective we're talking about through entrepreneurship, understanding the relationship that immigrants have to entrepreneurship and growth and job creation, to me, that's the hardest part of what's happening now in the administration to swallow. We're in desperate need of entrepreneurs, of people in this country, where we have an aging problem that's going to start to catch up to other places like Japan, which solved it way too late. And we need immigrants to settle in a bigger part of America. And the fact that we're closing our door on immigrants, we're closing our door on refugees, to me is not just wrong policy, but it's un-American. And it's personally insulting, because I feel like every generation we go through this same conversation and we look back on it and we think to ourselves, wow, that was a huge mistake. We definitely shouldn't have interned the Japanese. We definitely shouldn't have closed the borders to Jews who were escaping the Holocaust. We
sending them back. We
definitely should have sent them. We definitely should be turning our border on refugees trying to come here from Africa. And then every generation we make the same mistake. And we do it because at the end of the day, it's I believe it's low-hanging fruit meat to throw to people when you're not willing to provide a smarter, better answer. And I think that's where we are now. But I understand why people are scared for a lot of the reasons we're talking about. They don't feel like they're part of this wave of economic activity. But the idea of creating a scapegoat of immigrants once again, to me, is like the worst form of what it is to be American. And I think it's hurting our place around the world and hurting, sort of the reputation and brand of what it is to be American.
So to that effect, President Obama was arguably one of the greater ambassadors, figureheads globally. I think when people, everybody looked at America outside more positively, let's say, than with other presidents. I think that's a fair statement. Today, you could argue that a lot of countries don't share that same perception of the U.S. because of Donald Trump. But Donald Trump, even if he got less votes than Hillary Clinton, was elected president. So is this the real America, actually? Like, when he says racist things, is it that the American citizens who even supported him are like, well, we could overlook that? Or is he basically showing America's true colors? You know what I mean? Like, is it just like, we like him because of a few things, and he was a famous celebrity on this Apprentice show, and he's rich, so we should back him. Oh, he says some racist things, supposedly, but we'll overlook that? Or is it actually a bit more sinister that he's actually America, warts and all? If they could get away with it, this is like if they drank truth serum, this is America.
So, no, I'd say, but here's the way I view his presidency. We shouldn't underestimate the reasons why he was elected. And it was because people felt that the status quo in both parties didn't just have good answers, but were lying to them. And I don't think that's just a perception problem. I think that's a reality problem. I think that both parties have more and more failed in their ability to reach people and help them find solutions that are sort of up to date with where the needs are in the economy. But you have to judge a country over time. And I think one of the good stories about this presidency is it demonstrated how robust the institutions in America are for the most part. We have a legal system that so far is working, creating checks. We have a Congress that I think is creating checks. Open question about whether the media is doing its job in telling the story in the way it's supposed to. And I think over time we'll get through this administration and move on to another outlook on life. The American electorate is pretty responsive to the last president, and I think you'll see that in whoever the Democratic nominee is.
Who do you think should be the Democratic? And can you talk about that freely, or are you going to give us a very diplomatic not answer?
No, I'm not in government anymore. I don't have to be that diplomatic. I mean, listen, frankly, I think any Democratic candidate is going to have a very hard time running against President Trump. His approval ratings are in the mid-40s. He doesn't need much more than that to win. The economy is very strong. It's essentially unprecedented for an incumbent president to lose during a strong economy. In the last 150 years, it's just never happened.
The economy's stupid.
Yeah, and it's going to be his electorate is very strongly behind him.
Sorry to interrupt. When George Bush won in 2004 and beat John Kerry, that's when I was like, anything can happen. So I called Donald Trump winning a year before he won. Even I think the Republican nomination. So I right now, to quote Anthony Scaramucci, whose conference we're at, who's the guy or girl that's going to take him on and beat him? That's what.
Well, sometimes I tell people that I think Donald Trump's more likely to be a 3-term president than a 1-term president, and that's a scary thing to think about. But just recently, he told people he thought he should have 2 more years.
I know, it's not that. I've said that. He's like looking for loopholes and.
So that worries me. You can't just run a candidacy that's anti-Trump, though. You have to run a candidacy that has a vision of the economy that rises above, which I do think Presidents Clinton and Obama did a brilliant job doing, and President Kennedy did a brilliant job doing, Ronald Reagan did a brilliant job doing.
So who would you say is the best?
So I really like it, and I'm biased because he's a friend of mine, but I really like Mayor Pete Buttigieg. I mean, he is for sure, a dark horse candidate who has, I think even more quickly than he thought, jumped into the consciousness of Democratic voters as someone who's the anti-Trump. He's an educated veteran, well-traveled, speaks a bunch of languages, is not dramatic. Like, he's a pretty straightforward guy who's giving smart, practical answers to problems. And I'd like to think that Pete can win.
I see him more as a VP, like on that ticket. I could see that happening. I think if he wins, there's a movie that's going to be made the next day because it's going to be such a crazy story.
Yeah.
And the fact that he's gay, which is fantastic. Like, I'm just saying it's so unlikely as a story.
It's funny you say that. The thoughts cross my mind too. But keep in mind, we just elected an African American president twice, and then Donald Trump. Yeah. So to say it's crazy to elect a Rhodes Scholar Army veteran to me is like not that crazy.
No, I just meant like I wouldn't start off with he's a gay candidate. It's clearly like veteran, well-educated, and there's always a regression to the mean. So if you think of it like George Bush was the opposite of Bill Clinton and Obama was the opposite. So I think like the total opposite of Donald Trump is Mayor Pete, but you should also include, and he's gay. You know what I mean? And he doesn't need to be, you don't need to start off with that, but that's just such a total opposite of what you've seen. But I also think like America's not there. And when Obama won, I said, I told you, America is actually still more biased and sexist than they are racist.
Well, who knows? Until we elect a female president, and then we'll think, oh, we've solved that problem too.
Does Elizabeth Warren have a shot?
Of course, she's got a shot. I mean, she's a strong candidate.
She's a very strong candidate.
Frankly, there are only 5 or 6, I think, really viable candidates at this point.
Okay, so let's handicap them. Is Bernie Sanders too crazy of a socialist? I'm Canadian, so to me, Bernie is tame when it comes to that. But are Americans like, no, Bernie, he's not just, old, but he's also a socialist? Do you think that's going to make it impossible?
Well, the most interesting thing about Bernie Sanders is he's been running as Bernie Sanders for the last 40 years. So it's not like he's like changed to fit the mood. The mood has sort of changed to fit him. Now, I don't fundamentally think he's going to be able to get over the finish line. I think in part it has nothing to do with his politics and more to do with a really fundamental issue, which I think all the candidates are going to have to reckon with a big part of the voting base of the Democratic primary are non-white voters. And particularly African-American voters are a big deal when you start getting past New Hampshire and Iowa into places like South Carolina and Michigan. And Bernie Sanders hasn't traditionally polled very well with them.
Why?
I don't know why, but my guess is that...
Is it political views or that he's Jewish? I mean,
that's an interesting point.
I can ask these things. As the Canadian atheist Muslim-born, I could say whatever I want. That may not be...
I suspect it's actually something different. I think people are... we spend a lot of time thinking about identity politics. I'm not sure that's how much people vote. If it's very interesting thing if you look at black voters and black Americans in general, they for sure on an absolute measure do the worst economically in the country compared to Hispanics and whites, but they tend to be the most optimistic because I believe the trajectory, if you look at black Americans, when you compare it to their grandparents who may have lived through the pre-civil rights movement, to their parents who were just in the middle of integration, to them where they've gotten through a lot of these social and civil rights barriers. Obviously, we haven't fixed them all. That trajectory slavery, yeah, but pre those days. But you're right. I mean, that was for sure the low point. The trajectory's gone up. If you talk to a lot of white Americans, particularly white males in the middle of the country, they feel like their trajectory has gone down. I mean, less opportunities. There's no longer this opportunity that you wake up one day, you don't go to college, and you have a job for life. It's just gone, and so it's changed dramatically. So I do think Bernie Sanders may not be talking to those voters, and someone more optimistic like Barack Obama or Bill Clinton did. Joe Biden polls very strongly.
Okay, so let's now go on Joe Biden one by one. What are his shots?
I mean, Joe Biden right now is the front runner for sure. I think he's taken over from Bernie Sanders as the front runner. I think in particular he's strong because he polls very well with those non-white voters. I think he's viewed as a steady hand, but I think he's got to present his vision of the country affirmatively, and he's got to show that he can get through a full race. Raising money and had the stamina to get through the end, and he hasn't traditionally done well on a national stage on his own electorally.
I don't want to just be like, is he too old, and not put that into context, because that is ageism. Is it weird that the board of directors would force a CEO to retire at 65 for all intents and purposes, but you could have the CEO of the country who's 80? Like my father-in-law, great guy, he should not be president of anything. You know what I mean?
Yeah, but you look at it in context. I mean, Joe Biden's about the same age. Donald Trump is about the same age. Bernie Sanders
How's that going?
Bernie Sanders is about the same age.
But that's my point.
Look at our congressional leadership, the Democratic leadership. The 3 most senior leaders in the House are all pushing 77. In the Senate, they're all pushing 70. So for whatever reason, the baby boomers have held on to power and the Gen Xers have never stepped in. Meanwhile, they're mortgaging the future for this next generation, whether it's climate change or the debt. They don't seem to care about what's going to come after them. But we've seen okay electing them in other contexts. I would prefer someone younger like Pete, who I do think has a new view of the world that may be more up to speed.
For an interview, so if you're chummy, maybe you could put our request.
Yeah, we'll see how this goes. Okay.
So moving along, just because I want to go through them all, isn't it unfair that we haven't even brought up your comment on Democratic black voters' influence on Democratic and female Kamala Harris?
Yeah. I mean, she does very strongly.
She seems like she's the real deal.
She does very strongly with black voters. Young voters like her, but practically speaking, I don't think has caught the same energy, at least recently, as Biden or Sanders or even Warren or Pete. But I'd certainly put her in the top pantheon of a half a dozen serious candidates.
O'Rourke?
Yeah, I think he's flamed out.
He's flamed out, yeah.
For sure.
Do you think there was a lot of hype and no substance? Was it sizzle before steak?
Well, people were very excited to see someone beat Ted Cruz on the Democratic side. He before Donald Trump, was the person I think who was most reviled in terms of Democratic politics. And Beto O'Rourke ran a great race, and he fell short. And, I think he had some missteps along the way, and I think he's got a very hard road to catch up.
Maybe you could come stand here. I'm kidding. Cory Booker.
I didn't know. Could I do that?
Yeah, you can do whatever you want. Cory Booker?
I know Cory Booker a long time. Was one of the champions and the kind of one of the chief movers behind the Opportunity Zones legislation. So I'm a big fan. I don't think he's caught the fire of the other candidates we talked to, but I would put him in that top half dozen as well.
The fork queen, Amy Klobuchar.
No, listen, I know a lot of folks who have worked in Congress for Amy Klobuchar. Her public and private reputation as being a hard boss is, I think, accurate. I'd like her policy views, but she has historically treated people the worst in Capitol Hill, and someone who's worked on Capitol Hill, I take that personally. So
fair enough, but you got a president who grabs women by the private part.
I did not vote for Donald Trump.
I get that. Okay, fair enough. Andrew Yang.
Another friend of mine, but a real long shot. And,
I'm going down the list. These are longer and longer.
I find I love what Andrew is trying to do, but fundamentally I don't buy universal basic income as a.
Why?
Well, one, it's not very practical because it's so expensive, and two, I don't think the American system. The values of the American system are to provide what's essentially a welfare-like handout without connecting it to empowering people to work and get the skills they need. We could expand the earned income tax credit, which is kind of a cousin to that program, dramatically, and even that would be a very expensive program. So I don't think it's very practical, but I do think it's a nice kind of Silicon Valley fantasy that he's trying to build into a bigger national movement.
Julian Castro?
Julian Castro, a fantastic guy. And my wife actually worked for his brother Joaquin, who's a member of Congress now. But again, I think he's just so far behind in the polls. He's got to show that he's got some kind of spark to be relevant.
Does anybody on the Republican side have a chance, or forget the chance first? Will there be a Republican who's going to come and challenge Donald Trump?
Well, there already is a Republican, Bill Weld, who I'm not even sure if that name is right because he's been so irrelevant to the conversation so far. But the best chance for a Democrat to win is to see a serious third-party candidate from the right run. And honestly, if the Republicans had any shred of self-pride about what it means to be a Republican now, they would run someone against Donald Trump, who's clearly not a Republican. He's a president who is anti-trade, who is doesn't care about the deficit, who takes a lot of these, who's clearly on social issues, is not a Christian conservative. So all the set of beliefs that were so core to being a conservative, I don't think is represented in this administration. And his foreign policy is not an internationalist foreign policy at all. It's very much absorbed within let's pull back to the U.S. So I think someone ought to run from the Republican Party. I assume the reason they're not is the same reason I want someone to run, because it makes it much harder for Donald Trump to win.
But it's also because I think Donald Trump is. He is as a Canadian, I have to use a hockey analogy, otherwise I lose my passport. Donald Trump will go in the corner and bruise the other guy, beat him down to the point of pulp, that I just feel a lot of Republicans wouldn't even have that courage. And they're like, what's the upside? A, I'm not going to beat him. 2, he's going to turn everybody against me. Then I become the Judas of my party, because if I win, it's like the salvation, but you're not going to win. So I just don't get the risk-return profile.
Well, the
only way that happens is and then Mitt Romney, who can't catch a break, he's not going to come back for a fifth. So who's that guy?
I realize this is unrealistic, but you have someone like a Ben Sass or senator from Nebraska who, professor of history, and if you take the historical view of this, how is this part of American history going to be viewed? How is the Republican Party going to be viewed? What is the threat to our institutions? We joke about the fact that he may push to stay in for a third term, and if that happens, you're talking about a constitutional crisis. I think the value of someone stepping up and stepping in now is to say, I was that guy who saw what was coming, didn't care about the fact that my party wins or lose. I was fighting for our democracy and our system and the values we've held true for 250 years, and I felt like we'd fallen off that cliff. And if you ask Republicans behind closed doors, they'll say, I agree with you. So if you agree in private, you should be willing to say it in public.
Yeah, so who do you think is the best ticket ultimately to take on Trump? You could tell me who you want to be that ticket with Mayor Pete on top, but like who would be the realistic as well to beat Trump?
Well, I think you need some kind of balance. So I'd love to see like a Mayor Pete ticket with, could be like a Pete Biden, so you have kind of that generational divide.
That would be great.
Could be like a Pete Kamala Harris ticket. You've got some gender and racial diversity.
Is that now the thing? Do you need that? Like, do you need to be like check off the boxes? Black, Asian, gay.
They basically found that, most studies have found that nobody really votes for the VP. The VP can have some impact in their home state, and really
Sarah Palin is crying right now.
They don't have much of an impact beyond it. So I don't know how much it matters from that perspective. I think the most important thing for a VP, and fundamentally where like a Sarah Palin pick was, historically problematic, is you're making that choice for someone to step in should something terrible happen to the president, and you need someone who can be a steward of the country. And I don't think John McCain thought that Sarah Palin could be that person then, and so that made it a dangerous pick. I think anyone on the Democratic side can scratch that itch, but I do think what the top of the ticket is going to look for is a little bit of balance one way or the other.
So a couple last questions. Thank you for your time. So you mentioned the word revolution and overthrow and stuff. What are the odds or probability? We're not talking Russia 1917 style revolution, or France, but like, what are the odds that this specter haunting America now, and all of a sudden the talks of socialism and the capitalism is bad, and for these billionaires to start thinking of solutions, like what are the odds that America sees something that the founding fathers never dreamed would happen, let alone the Ronald Reagan, just 20 years ago or 30, 40 years ago? What do you put the probability that something major happens in terms of change of, I don't know, not regime change, but what are the odds?
Well, they're low. But people didn't see the fall of Rome until it happened, right? Decline can happen in pretty dramatic ways, and I don't think we're there next year. But I do think if we see the next 10 years that look a lot like the last 10 years, and 10 years in the history of a country is not very much time, you're gonna have a major problem on your hand, because the ramifications of this kind of divide we're talking about affect people at their core. It creates life expectancy gaps of like 5 years within America between like developing world numbers and developed world numbers. It creates a sense that larger parts of the country, there's no future for them. The American dream, they're not part of the American dream. And then people start to do more and more dramatic things when they feel like they're backed into a corner, to use a semi-hockey analogy, and they don't have a lot of options. And that's when you feel like you gotta fight back. And so again, I think people generally buy, still, for whatever they say, still buy into the system because they're able to operate within it. But I don't think we're going to be able to survive another 10 years of what we had. And what's scary about that is nothing fundamentally has changed yet. The most important thing that's changed is that we elected Donald Trump, which was a sign to everybody we should start taking this seriously. But what has really changed in the Democratic or the Republican parties in terms of what they're advancing in terms of policies to change the status quo? And I'm not seeing a ton of it. And so, to tie us full circle to sort of where we were in the beginning, if we don't have something that dramatically changes the outcome of where people invest, where economic growth happens, where cities start to be reborn, so that more people feel like they're part of this massively changing global economy, it's where I think we're going to face increasingly larger political problems, which are going to lead to these political outcomes that are going to create a lot of unpredictability in our politics. And ultimately, that's the part that people, who are sort of empowered like the least. The fact that they can't rely on sort of traditional trajectories to get them to where they need to go. And that means people pull back and they stop investing, and they stop taking the risk that we need people to take to, sort of drive an innovation economy.
So a little bit of a couple lightning round questions, and then one final question more about balance and lifestyle. You're basically kind of like trying to moneyball entrepreneurship in a way. You're looking for opportunity zones, looking at data, looking at trends and stuff. But would you say that ultimately, what's more important to you, like ultimately for a startup to be successful, the idea or the execution of that idea?
Obviously you need both.
It's lightning round. You get zapped otherwise.
I think execution is always more important.
Founder or the team?
Probably the founder.
Founder. Okay, interesting. Last question. So, I've written a couple books. My third one, The Entrepreneur's Manifesto, The 10-Year Overnight Success. It tells the story of like YouTube, web video, and WatchMojo. It's like the founder, kind of just like my experience. But so I kind of like realized like the whole balance and the bullshit of startups where everybody's crushing it and everybody struggles. And I was building a company and going through a lot of challenges with the company where you start actually hearing of like entrepreneurs kill themselves, which you never discuss, right? And I've always been very Tony Robbins, glasses half full, but I was like, yeah, guys, this is what I've been saying. It's not all hunky-dory. Not everything goes upwards and to the right. So now you're seeing this kind of pushback against hustle porn, and you're saying it is a bit more searching for balance between work and life and play, so you don't lose your mind. So I have a good understanding of how it is to raise kids and just keep your sanity as working in this startup world. How is it working in BC when you're young, you're ambitious, you're clearly smart, you kind of have goals, you want to have a family? Is DC, I always see to their credit, like senators, you could say they're lazy or whatever, but they seem to be working sometimes at nights and evenings and odd hours. You guys are, you don't really seem to work in 9 to 5. How do you balance living in DC, working in politics with just, trying to be a normal father and husband?
Well, I'd say two different things. So I think in particular political jobs compared to government jobs can be very intense, and it's very mission driven. So similar in some ways to in entrepreneurship, you're willing to put in all that time and energy, not because there's big bucks at the end of the day, but because you're doing something important, because you have the ability to influence important decisions and important decision makers, and I think there's a certain intoxication in being able to do that. But at some point, people burn out from that lifestyle and need to make some money and raise a family. And I worked in the White House, which is probably the most intense of those environments. But honestly, running EIG as an entrepreneur, starting up this, what was this nonprofit group, trying to create this idea, and now starting up an advisory business to work with the fund managers and the communities to do it, and now I have 2 kids under 2, is far more difficult. And because at the end of the day, working in government, there's always a certain career trajectory and a certain job security that you can count on, and kind of go up a path. And what's I think always scariest about being an entrepreneur is you don't know at the end of the day, as much as you may have tons of confidence in your idea, if you're going to be successful, and if you hit your first mark of success, whether you can keep it going. And I think that's ultimately what's hardest about being an entrepreneur is you have to keep hitting the next mark, or else you start to both fear irrelevancy, and you might be facing real failure. And hopping off of that and being able to turn that over to someone else is really the transition point that every entrepreneur really needs. So you say the founder of the team. I think the founder is important because unless you get it going, I think you're unlikely to see new innovative things happening. But you ultimately have to be able to turn it over. And to tie that to our political discussion, one thing we just don't talk about enough in this country is how much leadership matters. Political leadership matters way more than we think. Not just at the federal level, but if you look at cities that succeed and don't succeed, a big chunk of that has to do with their mayor and both their public and their private sector leadership. And where we've seen a big failure is in our corporate leadership, not stepping up and saying, well, we have to care more about our business. We have to care about this community and this country. And so this program, Opportunity Zone program, is really meant to fill a gap in leadership, right? The private sector, big corporate space hasn't stood up. The government hasn't stood up and come up with answers that are addressing this clearly big need that people are feeling. And so now it's left to our last line of defense, which is individuals, to step up and do it. And I don't know if it's going to work, but I certainly think that there's a shot at creating a big enough marketplace that just by people operating in their own self-interest, of finding deals that can make them money, they're going to create the sort of building and growth and entrepreneurship in places that haven't found any better answers in the last 40 years. And so it's really a substitute for what is really the right answer, which is to have the right leadership of our institutions. But I think that's why you see such a rejection of those institutions by everybody. I mean, what's disliked more than our Congress, than our media, or our corporate institutions, or every institution's got a bad rap. So it really, that's what makes entrepreneurship so important, is that it becomes a form of micro leadership that can fill these huge gaps that we have all over the country.
The main thing, and then I have one last question. Thank you very much for your time. The main thing about entrepreneurship is it does let you, to quote Jack Welch, who was ironically the greatest executive of the 20th century in like corporations, is it lets you walk like straight from the gut. It lets you walk to the beat of your own drum. There's no real playbook. You could actually make the call of what's right and how to treat all stakeholders. Final question is, what's the single biggest difference between the White House during the Obama administration versus the Donald Trump administration?
So, I only had a direct exposure working directly inside the Obama White House. I do think you had a talent pool in the Obama administration, and a set of like core competency and expertise that's, I think, stronger than the Trump administration. And I think that's part because you were able to tap into the infrastructure of the Democratic Party in a way Donald Trump has not been able to, because he was such an outsider and had such outsider views.
But is it because he's an outsider, or because he's very much of a, for lack of a better word, narcissist?
I think I think there are a lot of Republicans, just like there are a lot of Democrats, uncomfortable with him and his presidency. And it takes some level of narcissism to be a politician, to think you're better at this job, particularly for president.
And an entrepreneur, to be fair.
But at the end of the day, you have to have competent people around you who are executing according to the guidelines and parameters are required of our system, which is the Constitution first, the rule of law first. And I think the fear for people going into the Trump administration of whether that's still true. And that's a big question that, as we talked about in the beginning, our institutions have absorbed pretty well. And I think the biggest worry is they're going to not be able to absorb that pain any longer, and we're in then a very problematic point in our history. And people have also seen, I think, talented, competent people come through the administration and come out the other end in a much worse shape, and so that's a cautionary tale for people who have other options of why they'd want to absorb that kind of pain.
I know we've covered a lot. Thank you very much. Is there anything you'd like to touch on that we haven't?
No. Oh, well, listen. I think this is the right moment to be talking about entrepreneurship, not just as an exotic, sort of tale a la Silicon Valley, the kind of HBO show, which I watch religiously, but as a tool to create the sort of change that we're all talking about in the country. And ultimately, I think that's what encourages people, what forces people to be an entrepreneur. They see a hole somewhere, whether it's in our politics or in industry or in their community, and they want to step up and fill it. And whether that's someone running for office or someone starting a company, they're solving the same type of problems. The reality is our support systems for encouraging that type of sort of spontaneous leadership have fallen apart across the country. And solving the entrepreneurship problem is going to be directly akin to how we solve these other big holes we're talking about around our economy and around our politics. So I hope policymakers are going to watch some of the perspectives you put out here and realize we need some massive change across the board to build in those support systems again.
You bring a very unique and fantastic insights with like one foot on the politics side and one foot on the business side. So thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Great chat. Thank you.